I was staring at my computer screen when I noticed movement outside my window. And what I saw made my blood run cold because there was a white SUV backing straight into my heated garage like they owned the place. The storm had been raging for 3 days straight across northern Michigan, dumping nearly 2 feet of snow on our little subdivision outside Traverse City. And apparently someone had decided my property was public parking. I grabbed my jacket and headed outside, the wind hitting me like a frozen wall as I trudged through the accumulating snow toward my detached garage. The SUV was already parked inside, engine still running, and I could see someone moving around in the driver's seat. My garage door was wide open, letting all the expensive heat I'd been pumping into that space escape into the winter air. I'd spent $3,000 last year upgrading the heating system specifically so I could work on my woodworking projects during Michigan winters, and now some random person was treating it like a public shelter. I yanked open the driver's side door, and that's when I first saw her. Middle-aged woman, blonde hair with obvious highlights, wearing a puffy North Face jacket that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She looked at me like I was the one who just committed a crime. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with entitlement. "Do you mind?" "I'm trying to stay warm here. Do I mind?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Lady, this is my garage. You're on my property." She pulled out her phone, scrolling through something with perfectly manicured nails. "I don't think so." According to the HOA records, this garage space is designated for temporary emergency use by any resident during severe weather conditions. I'm Deborah Patterson, HOA president, and I know my rights. My name is Morrison, and I've lived at 847 Pinewood Drive for 7 years. I bought this property specifically because it had the detached garage, and I'd never heard anything about emergency use provisions. But Deborah seemed absolutely certain, which made me pause for just a moment. "I don't know what records you're looking at," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the freezing wind, "but I own this garage. I have the deed. There's no provision for HOA use." Deborah's eyes narrowed. The previous owner, Mr. Henderson, signed a lease agreement with the HOA back in 2015. 5 years, renewable automatically unless either party terminates in writing. That means we still have access rights. Something about that didn't sound right, but standing in a blizzard wasn't the time to argue legal details. "Look, can we discuss this later? My garage is losing heat by the second." "Fine by me," Deborah said, settling back into her seat. "You can close the door. I'll be staying right here until the storm passes." "That's not what I meant." "I know exactly what you meant, Mr. Morrison, but I also know that if you try to force me to leave during a state of emergency, you could be liable for any harm that comes to me. Michigan has very clear laws about that." I stood there, snow collecting on my shoulders, trying to process this insane situation. Finally, I just walked away, slamming the garage door shut behind me. At least that would keep some of the heat in, even if it meant Deborah got to enjoy it. I needed to figure out what she was talking about before I did anything else. Back in my house, I pulled up every document I had from when I purchased the property. The deed was straightforward, nothing about HOA access or emergency provisions. I'd bought the place from Martin Henderson's estate after he passed away, and the sale had been handled by his daughter who lived in California. Everything had seemed completely normal at the time. I called my real estate attorney, Patricia Chen, who'd handled the purchase. It was Saturday evening during a blizzard, but she actually picked up on the third ring. "Lucas, what's wrong?" I explained the situation as quickly as I could. Patricia was quiet for a moment after I finished. "That's interesting," she said finally. There was no mention of any HOA lease in the title search, and that's exactly the kind of thing that should have shown up. If such an agreement existed and was still valid, it would have been a disclosure item. So she's wrong. Probably, but I'd need to see the actual document she's referring to. Even if there was a lease, you said she claimed it was from 2015. That would make it 10 years old. If it was a 5-year lease with automatic renewal, there should have been paperwork filed. Without that, most courts would consider it expired. Can you help me figure this out? Not until Monday at the earliest. The county offices are closed and I'd need to pull records to verify everything. My advice for now is to document everything. Don't do anything that could be considered threatening and sit tight. I thanked her and hung up, staring out my window at the garage. The lights were on inside, which meant Deborah was still there, using my electricity along with my heat. This was absolutely insane. The storm continued through the night. I barely slept, getting up every few hours to check if the SUV was still there. It always was. By Sunday morning, the snow had finally stopped, but the roads were still a mess. The county plows hadn't made it to our subdivision yet, so nobody was going anywhere. Around 9 in the morning, I saw Deborah emerge from the garage, stretch, and walk up my driveway. She knocked on my door with the confidence of someone who believed she had every right to be there. I opened it, already exhausted from this whole situation. "I need to use your bathroom," she announced. "Absolutely not. The lease agreement includes reasonable access to facilities." "There is no lease agreement, not anymore." Deborah pulled out her phone again, showing me a scanned document. It was indeed a lease, signed by Martin Henderson, granting the HOA access to the garage for emergency situations. The date was July 2015, and the term was 5 years with automatic renewal unless terminated in writing by either party. "Where did you get this?" I asked. "From the HOA records, obviously. I've been president for 3 years and I make sure to know all our agreements and covenants." "This lease expired in 2020. That's 5 years ago." "Automatic renewal," Deborah repeated slowly like I was stupid. "Unless terminated in writing. Show me the termination letter." "I don't have one because I didn't know about this lease. I bought the property in 2022. "Not my problem." The lease transferred with the property. I took a screenshot of the document on her phone before she could pull it away. "I'm going to have my attorney look at this." "You do that. In the meantime, I'm going back to my warm spot in your garage, and I still need to use a bathroom. If you won't let me use yours, I'll have to file a complaint about unsanitary conditions." The whole situation was giving me a headache, but I was also starting to get angry. Really angry. This woman had invaded my property, was refusing to leave, and was now demanding access to my house. There had to be something I could do. "The gas station on Highway 31 is probably open," I said. "They have bathrooms. That's 3 miles away and the roads aren't plowed." "Sounds like a personal problem." Deborah's face flushed red. "You're being incredibly hostile and unreasonable." "I'm going to document all of this for the HOA board." "You do that." She stormed back to the garage, and I watched her SUV back out a few minutes later, struggling through the snow toward the main road. Good riddance, I thought, but my relief was short-lived. Within an hour, she was back, and this time she wasn't alone. 2 other vehicles pulled up behind her SUV, both struggling through the deep snow. I recognized one of the drivers as Ted Yamamoto, who lived on the next street over. The other was a woman I'd seen at HOA meetings but never actually spoken to. They both parked in my driveway, got out, and followed Deborah to my front door. "Mr. Morrison," Deborah said when I answered. "This is Ted Yamamoto, HOA Vice President, and Sharon Williams, HOA Treasurer." I've briefed them on the situation. The situation where you're trespassing on my property? Ted cleared his throat. He seemed less confrontational than Deborah, which was something at least. Lucas, we're not trying to cause problems, but if there's a valid lease agreement, we need to respect it. Can we come in and talk about this reasonably? Against my better judgment, I let them in. We sat in my living room, snow melting off their boots onto my hardwood floors. Let me see the lease, I said to Deborah. She pulled up the document on her phone again, and I read it more carefully this time. The language was pretty clear. The HOA could use the garage for emergency purposes, specifically for storing equipment or providing shelter during severe weather. The term was 5 years, from July 2015 to July 2020, with automatic renewal unless either party provided written notice of termination at least 30 days before the renewal date. Here's the thing, I said. Even if this lease was valid, which I'm not conceding, there's no record of renewal. You can't just claim automatic renewal without documentation. The documentation is right here, Deborah insisted. The lease itself says automatic renewal, but nobody filed anything. When I bought this property in 2022, there was no mention of any HOA lease. My attorney says that if such an agreement existed and was still active, it should have shown up in the title search. Sharon, the treasurer, spoke up for the first time. I've been going through our financial records, and I don't see any payments related to this garage lease. Usually, even if something is for emergency use only, there would be some kind of administrative fee or insurance payment. Deborah shot her a look. That's because it's a reciprocal agreement. We provide services to all residents, and in exchange, we have access to certain facilities. What services? I asked. Snow removal, landscaping of common areas, street lighting maintenance, all of which are covered by our regular HOA fees. This is separate. The conversation was going in circles. Ted tried to play mediator, suggesting we table the discussion until the roads cleared and everyone could get legal advice. But Deborah wasn't having it. I'm not leaving that garage until this storm situation is completely resolved, she said. The weather service is calling for another system to move through tonight. I have every right to be there. No, you don't, I said firmly. That lease, even if it was valid once, expired, and you know what else? Even if it hadn't expired, there's nothing in there about parking your personal vehicle for your own comfort. It says equipment storage and emergency shelter, which I assume means for multiple people during a community emergency, not one person treating my heated garage like a hotel. That's your interpretation. That's what the words actually say. We argued for another 20 minutes before they finally left. Deborah went straight back to my garage, parking her SUV inside and closing the door. Ted and Sharon drove away, both looking uncomfortable with the whole situation. I called Patricia again, sent her the screenshot of the lease, and waited for her response. It came about an hour later. "This is interesting," she said. "The lease itself looks legitimate, but here's the problem. When you purchased the property, the title company should have found this if it was still active. The fact that they didn't suggests one of two things. Either it was never properly filed with the county, which would make it questionable legally, or it had already expired and wasn't relevant to the sale. So what do I do? Tomorrow morning, first thing, I'm going to pull the complete title history and check with the county recorder's office. In the meantime, document everything Deborah does. Take photos, keep records of how long she's there, what she's using. If this goes to court, you'll want evidence. Can I make her leave? Not forcibly. Michigan law is tricky during emergencies. If she claims she has nowhere safe to go and the weather is dangerous, forcing her out could open you up to liability. But once the weather clears and the roads are safe, that argument disappears. I spent the rest of Sunday taking photos and videos, documenting everything. The storm system that was supposed to hit that night never materialized, which was good news for everyone, except Deborah's excuse for camping in my garage. By Monday morning, the county plows had been through our subdivision, and the roads were mostly clear. At 8 in the morning, I walked out to the garage and knocked on the window of Deborah's SUV. She rolled it down, looking annoyed. "The storm's over. Roads are clear. Time to leave." "I'm not going anywhere until we resolve the lease situation." "There's nothing to resolve. The lease is expired, assuming it was ever valid in the first place. You need to leave now or I'm calling the police." "Go ahead. I'll show them the lease." I went back inside and called the Traverse City Police non-emergency line. I explained the situation to the dispatcher, who said they'd send an officer out when one became available. It took about 45 minutes. Officer Rodriguez was in his late 30s, looked tired, and clearly had better things to do than referee a property dispute. He listened to both sides, looked at the lease document on Deborah's phone, and shook his head. "This is a civil matter," he said. "I can't force her to leave based on a disputed lease agreement. You'll need to go through the courts." "She's been here for 2 days," I protested. "Using my heat, my electricity, essentially living in my garage without permission." "Sir, I understand your frustration, but unless you can definitively prove she has no right to be here, this isn't a criminal trespass situation. You need to file for an eviction or get a court order." Deborah looked triumphant. "Thank you, officer. Finally, someone who understands property law." After Rodriguez left, I called Patricia again. "They won't remove her." "I figured as much, but I have good news. I've been going through the records, and that lease was never filed with the county. In Michigan, for a lease to be binding on future property owners, it needs to be recorded. Since it wasn't, it doesn't automatically transfer when property is sold. Martin Henderson might have had an agreement with the HOA, but that agreement didn't survive the sale to you. So I can make her leave." "Yes, but we should do it right. I'm going to draft a formal notice of trespass. Once she receives it, if she doesn't leave, then it becomes criminal trespass and the police will have to act." "How long will that take?" "I can have it done by this afternoon. We'll need to serve it to her properly, which might require a process server if she won't accept it voluntarily." "Do it." The notice was ready by 3 in the afternoon. Patricia emailed me a copy and also sent one to the HOA's registered address. The notice was clear. The lease agreement was invalid because it was never properly recorded. It had expired regardless, and Deborah had 24 hours to vacate the premises or face trespass charges. I printed it out and walked to the garage. Deborah was sitting in her SUV scrolling through her phone. When I knocked, she rolled down the window with an exaggerated sigh. "What now?" "This is a formal notice of trespass from my attorney. You have 24 hours to leave." She took the paper, scanned it quickly, and laughed. "This is meaningless. You can't just declare our lease invalid. It was never recorded with the county. According to Michigan law, that means it doesn't transfer with property sales. The agreement Martin Henderson made died with him, or at least when his estate sold the property." "We'll see what a judge says about that." "Yes, we will. In the meantime, you're officially on notice. If you're still here tomorrow at this time, I'm calling the police again, and this time they'll have to arrest you for trespassing." Deborah's confident expression faltered slightly. "You wouldn't. Try me." I walked back to my house, adrenaline pumping through my veins. Part of me couldn't believe this was actually happening, that an HOA president thought she could just take over someone's property based on a decade-old, improperly filed lease agreement. But another part of me was grimly satisfied that I was finally taking control of the situation. The next 24 hours were tense. Deborah didn't leave, but she also didn't venture out of the garage much. I saw her drive away once, presumably for food and bathroom breaks, but she always came back. When the deadline arrived at 3 o'clock Tuesday afternoon, her SUV was still parked in my garage. I called the police again, this time explaining that I had served a formal trespass notice and the deadline had passed. Officer Rodriguez returned, along with a female officer whose name tag read Martinez. "You served notice?" Rodriguez asked. I showed him the copy, along with the email confirmation that Patricia had sent to the HOA's address. 24 hours ago, and she's still here, see for yourself. We walked to the garage together. Deborah saw us coming and got out of her vehicle, holding her phone up like it was a shield. "I'm recording this," she announced. "I want documentation that I'm being illegally forced from property I have legal right to occupy." "Madam," Officer Martinez said calmly, "we've reviewed the situation. The lease you're claiming was never properly recorded with the county. According to Michigan property law, unrecorded leases don't automatically transfer with property sales. That means you don't have legal standing to be here." "That's not how it works," Deborah insisted. "Automatic renewal means, madam, I'm not here to argue legal theory. You've been served with a trespass notice by the property owner. The grace period has expired. You need to leave now, or we'll have to place you under arrest." For the first time since this whole nightmare started, Deborah looked genuinely uncertain. "This is outrageous. I'm the HOA president. I have responsibilities to our community." "That may be, but this isn't HOA property. It's private property and you don't have permission to be here. Please gather your belongings and move your vehicle." Deborah looked at me and I saw real anger in her eyes. "This isn't over." "Yeah, it is." She got in her SUV, started it up and backed out of the garage slowly. The two police officers watched to make sure she actually left the property, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me when she finally turned onto the street and drove away. "Thank you," I said to the officers. "Just doing our job," Rodriguez replied. "But fair warning, if she does have a legal claim to that garage space, she could sue you. Make sure your attorney has all the documentation ready, already done." After they left, I stood in my garage, looking at the space that had caused so much trouble. Everything seemed normal, except that my heated floor had been running constantly for 2 days straight, and my electricity bill was going to be astronomical. I made a note to document the extra costs for potential legal proceedings. That evening, I got a call from Ted Yamamoto, the HOA vice president. "Lucas, I need to apologize," he said. "I've been going through our records more carefully, and Sharon and I both agree that Deborah has been misrepresenting the situation." "How so?" "That lease agreement was specifically between Martin Henderson and the HOA for equipment storage during his tenure as HOA president back in 2015. He had salt spreaders and snow removal equipment that he kept in your garage for community use. When his term ended and he stopped managing the snow removal, the equipment was moved elsewhere. The lease should have been terminated then, but nobody ever filed the paperwork. So it expired through abandonment, essentially, yes. And even if it hadn't, the terms were never meant for personal use like Deborah was claiming. She just saw an opportunity to get access to a heated garage during the storm and twisted the facts to suit her needs. That's not just wrong, it's fraud. I know. Sharon and I are calling for an emergency HOA board meeting. We're going to recommend that Deborah be removed as president. I appreciate that, but honestly, I just want this whole thing to be over. I understand, but you should know, there are other issues coming to light. Once we started digging into this, we found some other questionable decisions Deborah's made. Missing receipts, contracts awarded to her brother-in-law's company without proper bidding, things like that. This was getting more interesting. How much are we talking about? I'm not sure yet. Sharon's doing a full audit, but it could be substantial. Keep me posted. The next few days were relatively quiet. I went back to work at my job as a software developer, working from home as usual, and tried to forget about the whole garage incident. But Deborah apparently wasn't done. On Friday, I received a certified letter from a law firm in Traverse City. Deborah was suing me for illegal eviction, emotional distress, and breach of contract. She was seeking $25,000 in damages plus attorney fees. I forwarded everything to Patricia immediately. "She's grasping at straws," Patricia said when she called me back. "But we'll need to respond properly. I'll file an answer to the complaint and also countersue for trespass, theft of services, and harassment. This is going to cost you some money in legal fees, but I'm confident we'll win." How confident? Very. She has no recorded lease. The one she claims to be relying on was clearly abandoned, and her use of your property exceeded anything the original agreement would have permitted even if it were valid. Plus, if what Ted told you about financial irregularities is true, her credibility is going to be shot. The lawsuit crawled through the court system for the next few weeks. During that time, the HOA held its emergency meeting, and Deborah was indeed removed as president. Ted became acting president, and Sharon continued her audit of the HOA finances. What she found was worse than anyone expected. Over the 3 years Deborah had been president, she'd systematically diverted HOA funds for personal use. The total came to over $75,000. She'd been creating fake invoices from her brother-in-law's landscaping company, paying them with HOA funds, and then getting kickbacks. She'd also been using the HOA credit card for personal expenses, disguising them as business costs. Sharon presented her findings to the full HOA board in early March, and they voted unanimously to file a police report. By mid-March, Deborah was arrested for embezzlement and fraud. I was at home when I saw the news story on the local TV station's website. "Local HOA president arrested for embezzling thousands," read the headline. There was a photo of Deborah being led out of her house in handcuffs, looking nothing like the confident woman who tried to commandeer my garage. The phone rang almost immediately. It was Ted. "Did you see?" he asked. "Just now. The prosecutor says she'll probably face multiple felony charges. She could go to prison." "Good. I'm sorry you got caught up in all this, Lucas. The garage thing was just the tip of the iceberg. At least something good came out of it. If she hadn't tried that stunt, you might never have looked deeper into the finances." True. Silver lining, I guess. The criminal charges against Deborah moved faster than the civil suit. In Michigan, embezzlement of that magnitude is a serious crime, and the prosecutor had overwhelming evidence. Bank records, fake invoices, testimony from Deborah's brother-in-law who cut a deal to testify against her. Everything pointed to a clear pattern of theft and fraud. In early April, Deborah pleaded guilty to multiple counts of embezzlement and fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence. The judge sentenced her to 3 years in prison, plus restitution to the HOA for the full amount stolen with interest. As for the lawsuit she'd filed against me, her attorney withdrew it the day after her arrest. Patricia sent me an email with the dismissal notice and a simple message: "Congratulations, it's over." But it wasn't quite over yet. The HOA still needed to recover the stolen money, and Deborah's assets weren't enough to cover it. Her house went into foreclosure, her cars were sold, and the HOA even managed to get a lien on her ex-husband's business, since some of the stolen money had been funneled through it. In May, I received a formal apology letter from the HOA board, signed by all 5 members. They expressed regret for the incident with my garage, acknowledged that I had been wronged, and enclosed a check for $1,500 to cover my increased utility costs. During the 2 days Deborah had occupied the space, plus compensation for my time and stress. I deposited the check and filed the letter away. The whole experience had been surreal, like something out of a bad reality TV show. But it had also taught me something important about standing up for yourself, even when someone in authority tries to push you around. In June, Ted called me with an unexpected request. "We're looking for new board members. After everything that happened with Deborah, we want people who will actually look out for the community's interests. Would you be interested, me, on the HOA board? Why not? You've already proven you're not afraid to fight for what's right. Plus, we need people with integrity." I thought about it for a few days. Part of me wanted nothing to do with HOA politics after everything that had happened. But another part of me recognized that communities need good people willing to serve, especially after corruption has been rooted out. "Okay," I said finally. "I'll do it." I was elected to the HOA board at the annual meeting in July. My first order of business was working with Sharon to implement new financial controls and transparency measures. We created a system where all expenditures over $500 required 2 board members' signatures. We published monthly financial reports for all residents to review, and we hired an independent auditor to review our books quarterly. We also went through all the old agreements and leases the HOA had entered into over the years, properly terminating the ones that were no longer relevant and making sure everything was correctly filed with the county. It was tedious work, but it needed to be done. One Saturday in August, I was working in my garage, finally able to use it for its intended purpose, building furniture. I'd started on a dining room table, carefully measuring and cutting oak boards. The heated floor kept the space comfortable despite the morning chill, and I had music playing softly in the background. There was a knock on the door. I looked up to see a woman in her early 30s standing there, holding a casserole dish. "Hi," she said. "I'm Olivia Sanders. I live 3 houses down. I heard about everything that happened with Deborah and your garage, and I just wanted to say thank you." "Thank me for what?" "For standing up to her. Deborah had been bullying people in this neighborhood for years. She tried to fine me $200 because my grass was supposedly half an inch too tall. She threatened my neighbor with legal action because his kids' play set was unsightly. Everyone was afraid of her because she acted like she had all this authority. But when you fought back and won, it exposed everything she'd been doing." I accepted the casserole dish, not quite sure what to say. I was just protecting my property. Maybe, but it made a difference. This neighborhood is so much better now. People actually talk to each other again. We're not all afraid of getting fines or letters for stupid reasons. So thank you. After she left, I stood in my garage thinking about how one person's abuse of power can poison an entire community, and how exposing that abuse can heal things you didn't even know were broken. The trial for the embezzlement charges concluded in September. I attended as a witness, though I ultimately wasn't called to testify. The evidence was so overwhelming that Deborah's guilty plea had been almost inevitable. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Margaret Chen, delivered a scathing rebuke when announcing the sentence. "You were trusted with a position of authority in your community," Judge Chen said. "You were supposed to serve your neighbors to manage their collective resources responsibly. Instead, you stole from them systematically and brazenly. You used your position to enrich yourself and your family while hiding behind a veneer of community service. This court views such betrayal of trust as particularly egregious. In addition to your prison sentence, you will be required to make full restitution, and you are permanently barred from serving in any HOA or similar community organization in the state of Michigan. Deborah stood silently during the sentencing, her expensive clothes and perfect hair unable to hide the defeat in her posture. As she was led away, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that justice had been served, sadness that it had come to this at all. Outside the courthouse, several of my neighbors who had attended the sentencing gathered together. Ted, Sharon, Olivia Sanders, and a few others I'd gotten to know through the HOA board meetings. "Well, that's finally done," Ted said. "Now we can really move forward." "I still can't believe she thought she'd get away with it," Sharon added. "The fake invoices weren't even that sophisticated. If anyone had been paying attention, they would have caught her years ago." "That's the thing about people like Deborah," I said. "They rely on everyone else being too busy or too intimidated to look closely. She almost got away with it." We went to lunch together at a small restaurant downtown, talking about plans for the neighborhood, upcoming projects, improvements we wanted to make. It felt good to be part of something positive, to be building instead of just defending. Over the next few months, life in the subdivision improved dramatically. Without Deborah's constant threats and arbitrary enforcement of petty rules, people relaxed. Kids played outside more. Neighbors talked to each other instead of avoiding eye contact. The Halloween decorations that October were elaborate and joyful, without anyone worrying about violating some obscure HOA guideline. In November, Ted organized a neighborhood potluck at the community center. It was the first social event the HOA had sponsored in years that wasn't mandatory or awkward. Nearly every household sent at least one person, and the place was packed with families, food, and actual laughter. I brought wood-fired pizzas made in a portable oven I'd built in my workshop. They were a huge hit, and I found myself telling the story of the garage incident to a group of newer residents who hadn't heard the full details. "Wait," one of them said. "She actually tried to claim she had a right to use your garage." "For 2 whole days," I confirmed. "Used my heat, electricity, everything. She genuinely believed a 10-year-old lease that was never properly filed gave her that right." "That's insane." "Yeah, it was. But it led to uncovering all the embezzlement, so I guess something good came out of it." Olivia Sanders joined our conversation, bringing her husband Michael. "Lucas is being modest. He saved this neighborhood from a tyrant." "I wouldn't go that far." "I would," Michael said. "Deborah made our lives miserable. We actually talked about moving before all this happened. Now we love it here." The party went late into the evening, and as I drove the short distance back to my house, I reflected on how much had changed in less than a year. One moment of standing up for myself had cascaded into exposing corruption, reforming the HOA, and helping build a real community. When I got home, I noticed my garage door was slightly open. My heart jumped for a second before I remembered that I'd been working earlier and must have left it that way. I walked over to close it properly and stood for a moment in the doorway, looking at my workshop. The table I'd been building was nearly finished, just needed sanding and finishing. My tools were organized on the walls, the heated floor hummed quietly beneath my feet, and everything was exactly as it should be. Mine. Private. Secure. I pulled the door down and locked it, then walked back to my house through the cool November night, grateful for the peace and quiet that had finally returned to my life. December brought the first real snowstorm of the season. Another nor'easter that dumped 18 inches on northern Michigan overnight. I woke up early to start clearing my driveway and was pleasantly surprised to see neighbors already out helping each other. Ted was running a snowblower down the sidewalk. Michael Sanders was helping an elderly couple dig out their car. Olivia was organizing a group of teenagers to shovel walkways for residents who couldn't do it themselves. This was what community was supposed to look like. People helping each other voluntarily, not because an HOA president demanded it or because they were afraid of fines, but because it was the right thing to do. I joined in, spending the morning clearing driveways and walkways with my neighbors. When we finally finished, someone suggested hot chocolate at Ted's house, and a dozen of us crowded into his living room, wet and cold but in good spirits. "Remember last year's storm?" Sharon asked. Deborah sent out an email threatening to fine anyone who didn't clear their sidewalks within 12 hours. Never mind that some people were working or didn't have the equipment. She was just looking for reasons to collect money. "Don't remind me," Ted said. I got one of those fines because I was at a conference and couldn't get home in time. Had to pay $50. She would have kept going too if Lucas hadn't stopped her, Olivia added. Everyone looked at me, and I felt uncomfortable with the attention. I just wanted her out of my garage. "The rest sort of happened. But you didn't back down," Ted said. "You could have let her stay, avoided the conflict, let it go. Most people would have. Instead, you fought back, and that made all the difference." I thought about that. He was right. The easy thing would have been to let Deborah have her way, wait out the storm, and move on. But something in me had refused to accept her baseless claim to my property, and that refusal had led to everything else. As winter progressed into the new year, the HOA continued to function smoothly under new leadership. Ted remained president, Sharon continued as treasurer with enhanced oversight, and I served on the board alongside two other neighbors who'd stepped up to help. We implemented several improvements that residents had been requesting for years, but that Deborah had always blocked. New streetlights in the darker sections of the neighborhood. A community garden space on a vacant lot the HOA owned. Better snow removal contracts with actual competitive bidding. In February, I received notification that the HOA had recovered most of the money Deborah had stolen. Her house had sold, her other assets had been liquidated, and the lien on her ex-husband's business had paid out. The total recovered was about $60,000 of the $75,000 stolen, which wasn't perfect but was better than anyone had expected. The HOA board voted to use some of the recovered funds to create a legal defense fund for residents who faced unjust actions by future board members. We also established term limits and mandatory audits to prevent anyone from consolidating power the way Deborah had. In March, on a surprisingly warm afternoon, I was working in my garage with the door open when Patricia Chen, my real estate attorney, called. "I thought you'd like to know," she said. "I was at the courthouse this morning and ran into Deborah's former attorney. He mentioned that she's trying to appeal her sentence." "On what grounds?" "Something about the initial search of HOA records being improperly authorized." "It's a long shot, and it probably won't go anywhere, but I thought you should be aware. Thanks for letting me know. The appeal didn't worry me much." The evidence against Deborah had been overwhelming, and even if some initial searches were questionable, the subsequent investigation had been thorough and legal. But it was a reminder that she hadn't given up entirely, that somewhere in her prison cell, she was still trying to fight back. That evening, I attended a regular HOA board meeting at the community center. We had a full agenda, approving the budget for spring landscaping, discussing a proposal to add a dog park, reviewing applications from 3 families who wanted to install solar panels. Everything was professional, organized, and transparent. We published our agendas 3 days in advance, we kept detailed minutes, and we streamed the meetings online for residents who couldn't attend in person. It was such a stark contrast to how things had been under Deborah's leadership that sometimes I had to remind myself we were talking about the same organization. "Last item," Ted said as we neared the end of the meeting. "Several residents have asked about organizing a neighborhood watch program. Given everything that happened last year, people are more aware of the need for accountability and community vigilance. Sharon has volunteered to coordinate it." Sharon nodded. "I've already talked to the police department about what's involved. They'll send an officer to do training for anyone who wants to participate. The goal is just to keep an eye out for each other, report suspicious activity, that sort of thing." The proposal passed unanimously. After the meeting ended and most people had left, Ted pulled me aside. "I wanted to thank you again," he said. "When you first joined the board, I wasn't sure if you were just doing it out of obligation or because you really wanted to help. But you've been incredible. The work you did on the financial controls, the transparency initiatives, it's made such a difference." "It needed to be done." "Sure, but someone had to actually do it. A lot of people talk about making things better. You actually put in the work." I appreciated the recognition, but I also knew I hadn't done it alone. Sharon, Ted, and the other board members had all contributed. Even residents who just showed up to meetings and asked good questions had played a part. Change required collective effort. April brought spring weather, flowers blooming in yards throughout the subdivision, and a sense of renewal. The neighborhood looked better than it had in years. Without fear of arbitrary fines, people had started taking pride in their properties again, planting gardens, painting fences, making improvements. I finished the dining room table I'd been building and sold it to a couple in town for $1,200. It was my first successful furniture sale, and it felt like a validation of all the time I'd spent developing my woodworking skills. More importantly, it reminded me why I'd wanted that heated garage in the first place, why I'd been willing to fight for it. In May, almost exactly a year after Deborah's arrest, I got a call from the prosecutor's office. Deborah's appeal had been denied. Her sentence would stand and she would serve the full 3 years. The prosecutor wanted to know if I wanted to make a victim impact statement for the record. I thought about it but declined. I'd already said everything I needed to say, and rehashing it all seemed pointless. Justice had been served. Moving forward was more important than looking back. That weekend, the neighborhood held its first annual spring festival, a new tradition we hoped to establish. There were bouncy houses for kids, a barbecue competition, live music from local bands, and booths where residents could showcase hobbies or side businesses. I set up a booth displaying photos of the furniture I'd built, along with information about custom orders. By the end of the day, I had 3 new commissions and a dozen inquiries. Olivia Sanders had a booth selling handmade jewelry. Michael was giving martial arts demonstrations with his students. Ted was grilling burgers and hot dogs. As the sun set and the festival wound down, I stood watching families pack up their things, kids running around with painted faces and balloon animals, neighbors laughing and talking together. This was what I'd fought for, even if I hadn't known it at the time. Not just my garage, but the principle that communities should be built on cooperation and respect, not intimidation and abuse of power. "Penny for your thoughts," a voice said behind me. I turned to find Sharon standing there, holding a paper plate with a piece of cake. "Just thinking about how much has changed," I said. "It's remarkable, isn't it? A year ago, we were all living under Deborah's thumb. Now look at us." "You think it'll last? Or will we eventually get another Deborah?" Sharon considered the question seriously. "I think what we've built will help prevent it. The transparency, the checks and balances, the engagement from residents. It's not perfect, but it's so much better than having one person with unchecked power. I hope you're right. Besides, Sharon added with a smile, if someone does try to pull what Deborah did, they'll know what happened to her. That's a pretty good deterrent. Summer arrived with warm temperatures and long sunny days. I spent my evenings and weekends in the garage, working on furniture projects and enjoying the space I'd fought to protect. The workshop had become my sanctuary, a place where I could create things with my hands and forget about software code for a while. In July, on the anniversary of my joining the HOA board, Ted announced he was stepping down as president. His job was transferring him to Seattle, and he'd be moving at the end of the month. The board held a special election, and to my surprise, several people nominated me for president. I won by a comfortable margin and found myself in charge of the same organization that had tried to steal my garage just over a year earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me. My first act as president was to establish an annual review of all HOA agreements and leases, ensuring nothing fell through the cracks the way that garage lease had. My second was to create a committee to review and update our covenants, removing outdated or overly restrictive rules that served no real purpose. Over the following months, we eliminated dozens of petty regulations that Deborah had either created or enforced zealously. The rule about grass height was revised to be more reasonable. The restrictions on holiday decorations were loosened. The prohibition on certain types of plants was removed entirely. The changes weren't dramatic individually, but collectively, they represented a shift in philosophy. The HOA existed to serve the community, not to control it. We were there to maintain common areas, handle shared expenses, and facilitate cooperation. We weren't there to micromanage how people lived in their own homes. In September, I received a letter from Deborah's attorney. She was requesting early release from prison for good behavior and wanted letters of support from community members. The attorney asked if I would be willing to write one. I read the letter twice, then filed it away without responding. I had no interest in helping Deborah get out early. She'd committed serious crimes, betrayed the trust of an entire community, and shown no real remorse. Serving her full sentence was the least she could do. 2 weeks later, Sharon told me that Deborah's request for early release had been denied. Not a single person from the neighborhood had written a letter of support. That spoke volumes about how she'd treated people during her time as president. October brought beautiful fall colors to northern Michigan, the trees around our subdivision turning brilliant shades of red, orange, and gold. Halloween decorations went up throughout the neighborhood, more elaborate than ever. One family created an entire haunted graveyard in their front yard. Another set up a display with animatronic ghosts and zombies. Nobody worried about HOA complaints or fines. On Halloween night, I handed out candy to trick-or-treaters from my front porch, watching the streams of kids in costumes going from house to house. Several parents stopped to thank me for my work on the HOA board, for making the neighborhood a better place to live. "My kids love it here now," one mother said. "Last year they were afraid to ride their bikes because Deborah would yell at them if they touched her grass. Now they can just be kids." Those small moments of positive feedback meant more to me than any formal recognition could. I'd accidentally become part of something important, a transformation that had improved people's daily lives in real, tangible ways. November rolled around again, marking a full year since the neighborhood potluck, where I'd first felt like things were really changing. We held another potluck, even bigger than the previous years, with even more families participating. During the informal speeches and toasts that happened near the end of the evening, Sharon stood up and called for attention. "I want to recognize someone who changed this community for the better," she said. Lucas Morrison could have just let Deborah use his garage and avoided all the trouble. Instead, he stood up for himself, which led to all of us standing up for ourselves. Because of his courage, we uncovered corruption, reformed our HOA, and built a real community. So thank you, Lucas. We owe you more than we can ever repay. Everyone applauded, and I felt my face flush with embarrassment. I hadn't done it for recognition or gratitude. I'd done it because it was right, because someone needed to push back against abuse of authority. But I appreciated the sentiment nonetheless. As December approached, and the year drew to a close, I reflected on everything that had happened since that February morning when I'd looked out my window to see a white SUV backing into my garage. In less than 2 years, I'd gone from being a guy who just wanted to work on woodworking projects in peace to being HOA president, helping lead a community transformation, and watching someone go to prison for crimes that might never have been uncovered otherwise. The experience had taught me several important lessons. First, that standing up for yourself matters, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable. Second, that one person's courage can inspire others to act. And third, that communities are fragile things, easily corrupted by bad leadership, but also capable of remarkable recovery when good people step up. My garage remained mine, heated and private, exactly as it should be. But it also represented something larger now, a symbol of the importance of protecting your rights and refusing to accept unjust authority. Every time I worked in there, I remembered the fight to keep it, and that memory motivated me to keep fighting for what was right in other areas of life. On a cold evening in mid-December, I was finishing up a custom bookshelf in the garage when my phone rang. It was Patricia Chen, my attorney, calling with unexpected news. "I thought you'd want to know," she said. "Deborah Patterson's ex-husband just filed a lawsuit against the HOA." "For what?" "Wrongful lien on his business. He claims he didn't know about the embezzlement and shouldn't be held financially responsible for her crimes." "Is he right?" "Partially, maybe. It depends on whether he can prove he had no knowledge of what she was doing." The forensic accountants found evidence that some of the stolen money went into joint accounts, which suggests he might have known, but it's going to be messy. Great, just when things were finally settling down. "Welcome to HOA leadership," Patricia said with a laugh. "There's always something." She was right, of course. Leading any organization meant dealing with constant challenges, unexpected problems, and difficult decisions. But I'd learned that facing those challenges was better than avoiding them, that engagement was better than apathy, and that communities needed people willing to do the hard work of governance. The lawsuit from Deborah's ex-husband eventually settled out of court, with him repaying about half of what the lien had claimed, and the HOA agreeing not to pursue the rest. It wasn't a perfect outcome, but it was reasonable, and it closed another chapter of the whole sordid affair. As January arrived and a new year began, I found myself thinking about the future rather than the past. The neighborhood was thriving, the HOA was functioning well, and I had a growing furniture business that brought in supplemental income and creative satisfaction. Life was good. I'd learned that sometimes the worst situations can lead to the best outcomes, that standing up for yourself can change more than just your own circumstances, and that communities are built by people willing to fight for them. My heated garage had been worth defending, not just because it was mine, but because defending it had led to defending something much larger. The story of Deborah Patterson, corrupt HOA president, would become neighborhood legend, a cautionary tale about what happens when authority goes unchecked. But it was also a story about ordinary people finding their courage, about communities healing from corruption, and about the importance of never backing down when you know you're right. Every time I parked in that garage, every time I turned on the heated floor and picked up my woodworking tools, I was reminded of those lessons. And I was grateful, in a strange way, for that February morning when I'd looked out my window and seen a white SUV where it didn't belong. Because that moment had changed everything, had transformed not just my life but an entire community. The garage door closed behind me on another winter evening, the heated floor hummed beneath my feet, and I got to work on my next project, grateful for the space, the peace, and the hard-won victory that had made both possible.